Thank you, Jeff, and thank you all of those people Jeff mentioned. I cannot remember all those names for inviting me and giving me an opportunity to talk to you about the Holocaust in Hungary and in general, and specifically how the Holocaust affected my family personally. The name you see on the screen in bracket is the name in my birth certificate. I was born into a Jewish family on my mother's side. They were very observant Orthodox Jews. On my father's side, it's a branch of Hungarian Judaism equivalent to the conservative Judaism here. My great-grandfather was a rabbi in a small town in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And I changed my name, and that's part of my story and the part of the story of the Hungarian people and Hungarian Jews specifically, not just in Hungary, but in Europe. Probably many of you know or experience that most of the Jews have German-sounding names, and there are historic reasons for this. They were forced to change their names or have names in the language of the country they lived in, and because most of the Jews in Europe lived what was that time the Austrian-Hungarian Empire and some of the German principalities, most of the Jewish people have German-sounding names. And by that name, we were easily identified that we were Jewish. And because the long history of anti-Semitism in Europe, Jews were discriminated against for more than 2 millennia. And Jews tried everything to assimilate, especially in the 19th century, second half of 19th century and the early part of 20th century. Some of them converted to Christianity, some of them just changed their name, so they were not obviously Jewish. I changed my name when I was applying for college. It was my mother who kind of forced me to change my name. She was aware, very well aware, what happened to the Jewish people during the Holocaust. And she was afraid that anti-Semitism, although it was dormant during the communist system in 1962 when I changed my name, she was afraid that one day it will be alive and well again. And she wasn't a prophetess, but unfortunately it is the situation today that anti-Semitism is rampant all over Europe and specifically in Hungary. When I was born in 1941, my father was already taken to a so-called forced labor camp. The Hungarian government needed manpower. They were allies of the Nazi Germany, and the Hungarian army marched with the Nazi armies when they went or occupied Europe, especially the eastern part of Europe. And the Hungarian government decided that Jewish people should be conscripted to the army, but they weren't trusted, so they didn't get weapons or firearms. They were conscripted to the so-called forced labor battalion. That was very specific to Hungary. The history of Holocaust is a little bit different in Hungary than rest of the Europe. Hungary was not occupied by Nazi Germany until the spring of 1944. And the Germans or the Nazis didn't have a reason to occupy Hungary because Hungary was a willing ally of Nazi Germany, and the anti-Semitic laws in Hungary by 1940 were as bad as the so-called Nuremberg laws in Germany. So my father was conscripted to this forced labor battalion about 6 months before I was born, and he was not even present when I was born. There is only one picture of my father and myself, which was taken 3 months after I was born. He was released from the forced labor camp for a long weekend, and that was the time this picture was taken. He had to go back. That was the first and the last time he saw me. His battalion was taken to the Soviet Union with the Hungarian troops. The Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union in June 1941, and the Hungarian army marched to what is Ukraine today to help the Nazis. So my father was taken with the labor battalion there. What happened to him, we don't know exactly. The only thing we know, and my mother knew, was that she got a notification from the Hungarian Ministry of Defense that my father disappeared during the war activities. And I interrupt for a second here, telling you what I'm presenting today is a mix of some of my personal memories. I was only 40 years old. I'm a child survivor of the Holocaust. I was only 40 years old when the Budapest ghetto, where we survived with my mom, was liberated by the Soviet Red Army. So I have very few personal memories, but I do have the stories my mom told me, and that's part of the Holocaust history also, that I was in my mid-40s when my mom opened up and told me the rest of the story, told me what we went through, how we went into hiding, and everything you will hear in a few minutes. And that was very typical. People who survived the Holocaust, they didn't want to talk about what happened. Some of them, believe it or not, they were ashamed that they survived and their loved ones didn't. Others just were so distraught that they just did not want to talk about. And so this is why I'm a latecomer of learning about the Holocaust, especially our family history. I'm a latecomer not only because my mom didn't talk about it, but when I grew up, the Hungarian education system, which was a communist education system, and because Hungarians were complicit in the Holocaust, and especially the death of 3 out of every 4 Hungarian Jews, this topic was completely missing from the curriculum. Books weren't published, movies, documentaries weren't shown. So we did know that there was a war. We did know that some of our relatives died, but we did not know about the genocide against the Jewish people while we were educated and grew up in Hungary. Also, some of the things I will mention today, they are from the postcards my father sent from the forced labor camp. He was allowed to send one postcard by every week, which was censored, and He could not write anything about life in the camp. He couldn't write about where he was, what he was doing. The only thing he could write about was how he was feeling, how much he missed his family, and specifically my mom and myself. Also, my mom gave me 3 notebooks. Again, I was in my mid-40s when I learned about these notebooks existed. And this is the last picture of my father in the forced labor camp with the people who was in the same camp. And this is the picture of one of the many postcards I had the opportunity to read and to learn how my father felt during those months and 2 years before he perished. I would like to share with you just one paragraph from his last card, which he sent on one day after Christmas in 1942, before he was shipped to the Soviet Union. My little squirrel, this is a Hungarian term of endearment, and that's how he addressed my mom. Please write exhaustive letters, and if you can, please send lots of pictures of yourself and little Peter. I gaze on those pictures I have, and they give me strength to struggle. When I get home, we will talk a lot. The work is very hard, but I am getting stronger, and thanks to God, I can endure in good health. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. In early 1943, just a month and a half after this postcard was written, my mom got the notification that my father disappeared during the war activities. It was a standard form, already pre-printed, only my father's name was handwritten on that form. What happened to my father, we don't know exactly, but we do know what happened to those people who perished in the forced labor battalions. We do know that 40,000 out of the 100,000 who never returned died under various circumstances. Some of them died because they were not equipped for the harsh Russian winter or Soviet winter at that time. Temperatures were in the minus 30s and 40s, and the snow was knee-high or even waist-high, and they had to march with civilian clothes, and they were weak because there was not enough food, there was no medical attention, and many of them froze to death. If you stopped under those circumstances just for 5 minutes, you froze to death. We do know because some of them who survived later on after the war was over came back. They were captured by the Soviet Red Army and they were sent to Siberia. Those people survived even the Siberian gulags. And they came back, and some of them told their stories, and some of them published those stories. So we do know that some of the people frozen to death, others was shot by Hungarian officers. It was a kind of mercy killing because the officer claimed later on when they were put on trial that they did it because they didn't want those people to suffer. The process of being frozen may take 5 to 10 minutes, so they just shot those people to death. Other people died because they were used as for defusing mines. The retreating Soviet army left lots of minefields behind to slow down the German progress. And the people in the forced labor battalions were used to defuse them. Now, these people weren't expert. They weren't even trained. They used their very own body to defuse those mines. They were forced to walk through the minefield, and the mines exploded, and so did the people. So we do know that 40,000 never returned out of the 100,000, and unfortunately among them was my father. My mom hoped and hoped against hope that my father one day will return, and this is why he started the notebook, which shown here. It wasn't really meant to be a diary. Actually, the first notebook has a lot of personal data of my mother's client. She was a female hat maker, and actually in the 30s and 40s, that was a very lucrative job. Hats were in fashion, and she was very good at it. So we had a relatively good middle-class living until the Holocaust happened. In 1944, March 19, German troops came to Hungary, and finally they occupied Hungary. And the situation of the Hungarian Jews changed dramatically. There were approximately 800 Jews who lived in Hungary, and actually Greater Hungary, because at the beginning of the war, Hungary reoccupied some of the territories which were taken away after First World War. Hungary was on the losing side, and about 1/3 of the territory and a little bit more than 1/3 of the Hungarian population were attached to the surrounding countries, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Romania, Austria. And that was one of the reasons for animosity for the Jews, because after the First War was lost, Hungarian Jews were the scapegoats. They were blamed that Hungary lost because the Jews were traitors. And they used the excuse that the Hungarian Communist Party in the early 1920s were very strong, and most of the leaders of the Communist Party were Jews. They were secular Jews. They didn't believe in God. They just happened to be born in a Jewish family. And anyway, because of the many Hungarian Jews who were Jewish, Jews became the scapegoat, and animosity against the Jews were rampant. Actually, Hungary was the very first country in Europe which enacted an anti-Jewish laws which restricted the number of Jews at higher education institutions. And my father was actually the victim of this discrimination. He wanted to be a lawyer. He applied for law school 3 times, and he was rejected 3 times for one and only one reason, because he was Jewish. So after the German occupation, the situation changed dramatically in Budapest. The deportation of the Hungarian Jews started only in 1944. April. And in the matter of 3 months, 400,000 Hungarian Jews were deported from Hungary to the various concentration and killing camps in Germany, mostly in Auschwitz, but also Sobibor and Treblinka, and some of them ended up in Dachau and other camps. The logistic of transferring during wartime 400,000 people from Hungary to Poland was enormous. And of course the Germans, Adolf Eichmann, who was the infamous originator of the final solution, he came with 600 Gestapo men to Hungary, and they organized the deportation of 400,000 Hungarian Jews. The Hungarian government was complicit in the deportation and the death of these people because they provided the manpower to round up the Jews, first to force them into ghettos, and later on they were taken to the railway station and they were taken to Poland, and up until the Polish-Hungarian border, those trains were guarded by Hungarian police and Hungarian gendarmerie. My mom and I lived, as I said, in a relatively normal life until 1944. Food was already rationed, so normal at that time meant very different what normal is today. But we were alive and we had a hope that we will survive the war and the Holocaust. But in 1944, not only the deportation started, but also the forcing of Jewish people leaving their home, and they were forced to move to so-called designated houses. This is a picture. I'm going to return to this picture. First, I would like to tell you a little bit about these designated houses where the tenants who were not Jewish had to leave, and Hungarian Jews had to leave their apartment and move to these designated houses. These houses were marked with a yellow Star of David, just like the people. We had to wear the yellow Star of David on the outside of our clothes every time when we went to the street, which didn't happen frequently because there were curfew, and there was specific curfew for those people who lived in these designated houses and the Budapest ghetto. The Budapest ghetto was set up as a final place before the deportation. It was about an 8 by 5 city blocks surrounded by brick walls, and there were one entry point, and once you entered, you could never leave again. Never live again alive. My mom knew that we have to survive at any price, and she was determined that she will do everything she can. So instead of moving to one of these designated houses, we moved into the apartment of one of her childhood friend who risked her very own life by hiding us. The laws against people who hid Jewish people was as strict as the law against the Jewish people. Nevertheless, they took us in. We lived there for approximately a month or 6 weeks when some good neighbor reported us to the police. Next day, 2 policemen came and arrested my mom. That's one of my very few memories when my mom was taken away, because I remember the fancy uniform of the Hungarian police, and I also remember that we were sitting around the breakfast table. I was sitting on a chair on 3 or 4 phone books because I couldn't reach the table, and when my mother was taken, I started to cry, and the host family, they started to try to explain to me that there is nothing serious, that my mom will come back in 2 days, and they took good care of me for those 2 days. And my mom came back after 2 days. Whether it was a chance or a divine intervention or providence, we don't know until today. She was taken to the most infamous Hungarian jail, and when she got there, she took with herself, she couldn't explain the reason. I know this part of the story because my mom told me later, that notification from the Hungarian Department of Defense that my father died during the war activities. And she used that paper to claim that she was a war widow. War widows during that time in Hungary had some privileges. They had larger portion of the food or groceries they could buy and some other financial benefits, but only those who were wives of a regular Hungarian soldier were war widows. The people who served in the forced labor battalion, the Jewish men between the age 18 and 55, their widows were not entitled for the privileges of war widows. Anyway, my mom claimed that she was one. The warden or the guard at the jail, probably he couldn't even read what was on the paper. He got scared, or my mom scared him, that he's gonna get into big trouble because they arrested a war widow, and war widows were esteemed higher than anybody else. So this guard went to the commandant to the jail. My mom was taken there. My mom couldn't tell me, and she didn't know whether the commandant of the jail had pity on her, or he didn't know what that paper was. The result was that he let my mom go. He came back, and we had to move again. We had to move again because we just couldn't wait until somebody else would report us again, and we would endanger the life of the host family. And our next move happened to an apartment building which were bought by the gentleman on the screen, Raoul Wallenberg. Raoul Wallenberg was a Swedish diplomat who early 1944 came to Budapest. He was actually sent by the American War Refugee Board, which was set up by President Roosevelt at that time to help the remaining Jews in Europe. Early 1944, there were still many Jews alive and not well. Only 3 or 3.2 million died out of the 6 million at that point. And there were an international movement to save as many Jews as possible. It was too late and too little. And nevertheless, the Swedish diplomat, who actually wasn't even a diplomat, he was an aristocrat, and he was just sent by the Swedish government in diplomatic disguise to help the Hungarian Jews. He bought up 32 apartment buildings in Budapest, and he used this building to cram as many Jews, as many surviving Jews into these buildings, because according to international law, these buildings were regarded as territory of Sweden, so according to international law, no local authorities or police could enter into these houses. So anyone who was lucky enough and were able to get into this building were saved at least for a while. So my mom and I moved into one of these protected houses. That's the translation of the Hungarian terminology which were used. The buildings were surrounded by Hungarian Nazis, and they were there to guard those buildings. They just wanted to make sure that nobody leaves those buildings, because they hoped, they expected that one day they will move in those houses and now will get rid of the remaining Jews in Budapest. We lived in these protected houses about 2 months. In October 1944, the Hungarian far-right fascist party took over the Hungarian government. They couldn't care about international laws anymore, and the Hungarian Nazis moved into the buildings, into the building we stayed at, and started to arrest the people. Many of them were taken to the banks of the Danube River, which separates two parts of Budapest, Buda and Pest, and they were shot there at the banks. The bodies fell into the river, and they were washed away by the water. Many of them were taken straight to the railway station and the destination of the cattle cars. Obviously, these were not passenger trains, they were cattle cars where 60, 80, sometimes 100 people were crammed into these cattle cars, and after 3 or 5 days of journey without food, without water, they arrived to Auschwitz or Treblinka or Sobibor. At the platform, at the destination, they were selected into 2 groups. In one group, the men who were able to work as slave laborers at the concentration or death camps. Women and older people and children were in the other line, and they were taken straight to the gas chambers. They were dead 2 or 3 hours after they arrived at the camp. The men worked and worked and worked until they became so weak that they were taken to the gas chambers also, and they perished there also. Again, blind chance or divine intervention, we escaped again. And it was really a sheer luck, in a sense that the Nazis who came to our apartment to arrest my mom and me and to take to the Danube or the railway station were young, 16, 18-year-old Nazis. The older ones were already conscripted into the Hungarian army. And I and some of the children who were in that particular building, during our free time, we were playing in the inner court of the apartment building. They were square building, and most of them had an inner court, which could be and was used as a playground, actually. And what we played was robber and police. We had sticks, and we were shooting each other with those sticks, pretending that they were real rifles. And these young Nazis who guarded these buildings were there, and they were laughing at us because there we were young children with the yellow Star of David on our clothes, and we were killing each other. And at one point they decided it would be more fun if they would unload their real weapons and give it to us. So we as young boys, we were fascinated by those firearms, and we used them as a toy, and now we pretended poof poof, and people, my friends pretended that they died and they just fell down. Anyway, it turned out later when one of these young Nazis came to our apartment with his friends with the purpose of arresting us. He recognized me from the playground, and it seemed that we were friends because he knew me by my first name, and he told to his friends that let's go to the next apartment. I know little Peter, let's leave them here. So we were left there. The people in the next apartment weren't so lucky, and they were taken away. After the Nazis left the building, we had to move again, and this time we moved into the Budapest ghetto, where my grandparents already lived. Actually, the Budapest ghetto was set up what was the Jewish quarter of Budapest, and my grandparents happened to live there in a one-bedroom apartment, and by that time 2 of my aunts, my cousin, and then my mom and I were living in that one-bedroom apartment. It was very small. One bedroom meant one room, period, because there was just one room there. But we didn't spend much time in the apartment because by that time the Allied forces bombed Budapest regularly, relentlessly. So we spent most of our time in a temporary bomb shelter, which was actually the basement of the building with dirt floors and no electricity, no water, no food. I remember the place we stayed. I remember that my mom or my aunt was careful enough to save a blanket, so I and my cousin, we were again 3.5, 4 years old, we were playing on that one blanket, and I remember my cousin, she was much stronger than I was, although she was only 2 weeks older than I am, and she was chasing me all over the place, and I was shrieking that somebody would save me. But that was the pleasant memory I have, because most of the other memory I had wasn't this pleasant. As I said, the food was practically not available, so the dietary laws which we as Orthodox Jews tried to keep, we just couldn't keep it anymore. We ate whatever we could get. And what happened during 2 bombing raids, my mom, my aunt, or my grandmother went out, and they rummaged through the bombed out building looking for food, and they brought back whatever they could find. Some of them were spoiled or mold on the bread or whatever, but it was still food, and we ate them. And we ate not only bread or whatever else, but we ate food which was prohibited for religious Jews, namely bacon made out of pork. And I remember the day when my grandmother came back from one of this rummaging trip and brought back a big slab of Hungarian bacon, which is practically, there was no meat in it, it's just pure lard. And there are some paprika on the top of it because we put paprika on everything. Anyway, we broke the dietary law and we ate it because every calorie we could get into our body meant that we were able to survive one more day. And we survived until January 19, when the Soviet Red Army liberated the Budapest ghetto, and we could come out from the temporary bomb shelter, and we went back to our apartment. I remember walking through the streets of the bombed out Budapest, and I saw dead bodies on the street, dead horses on the street. And we were one of the few lucky ones that we not only survived, but we were able to reclaim our apartments, because most of the apartments after the Jews moved out, forced out by the Hungarian government, they were looted, they were occupied by non-Jews, and when people went back, the lucky ones who survived and tried to reclaim their belongings or the apartment itself, the people said, there is nothing here, everything was taken by somebody else, and by the way, this is our apartment and not yours. Again, we were lucky enough that the family which occupied our apartment not only preserved everything my mom left behind, because when we left, she was able to take me in one arm and a small suitcase with the absolute necessities, and everything else was left. And when we moved back, the family which occupied our apartment moved out, and I grew up among the furnitures my parents bought after they got married, and actually it's still there in that apartment, but that's for another story. To wrap it up, the rest of the story, I grew up in communist Hungary. Between 1945 and 1949, Hungary was a democratic country with many parties, among them Communist Party, Social Democratic Party, all the parties except the openly Nazi parties participated in the government and Hungary was occupied by Russian troops. They came, they kicked the Germans out, and they stayed. And in 1949, they installed a new Hungarian government, a communist government. All the parties were banned, and communist Hungary started to exist, and that's where I grew up, where I was educated. I was lucky enough that I got a good education. After 3 tries, I was able to get into college or university. I wanted to be a lawyer like every good Jewish boy, but I wasn't admitted for one reason, not because I was Jew this time, because I wasn't a loyal communist, and because half of the points which were counted for admission were based on merit, and the other half whether you yourself or your parents or even your grandparents were not the enemies of the people, which meant they were good communists or sympathizers of the communists. I didn't get into law school, but I got into the Technical University of Budapest, and I got a master's degree in electrical engineering. I was lucky, and I use this word lucky so many times tonight that I have to stop using it. Anyway, I started working for a company which was working on the first Hungarian-made computer. So I learned everything about computer hardware inside out, also computer software and operating system. So in 1980, when I was so fed up with the communist system and there was no hope that it would ever change, I defected to the United States. I came here as a visitor, applied for political asylum, and I never looked back. I went back 10 years later when I became a US citizen, and the Hungarian common system was about to explode and disappear. Because of my profession and my skills, I got a good job. I was able, not lucky, but I was able to work on many of the space projects because my company was a contractor for NASA, and I was lucky enough to work on some of the major NASA projects. This is the picture from 1946. We tried to immigrate to the United States. We applied for an immigration visa. We were put on a list. That time was a very strict quota system. Just a certain number of people were allowed to come to the United States from certain countries. And by the time our numbers came up, it was 1949 when Hungarian communists closed the borders and we never left. Back to the present, Hubble Space Telescope I worked on. That was one of the major projects. I worked on some of the projects which were part of the space shuttle, and I worked on the space telescope which will be launched in 2022 according to the latest target date. That's the James Webb Space Telescope, which would replace Hubble. I live in the Maryland suburb of Washington, D.C. When I retired in 2014, I started to volunteer for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. That was a desire for me for a long, long time. And I only could afford time-wise after I retired, and some of my daughters got married, and I didn't have to work any longer. Anyway, for the museum, I do various things, among them going to places, telling my family story and the story of the 6 million Jews. And I want to close it with the last slide. No, this is not the last. This is the last slide. Never again, what you do matters. That is the motto of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And that's extremely important for me as a survivor to do anything and everything I can to preserve the memory of the 6 million Jews who perished during the Holocaust, among them 1 million Jewish children. And I put this picture on the screen to remind myself and remind everybody in this room what you do matters. They are young Hungarians who in 1944 arrived to Auschwitz. The picture was taken, it's a part of a bigger picture. Just after the arrival, they are a little bit older than I was at that time. 3 hours after their arrival to the Auschwitz platform, they were dead. They were taken from the railway station straight to the gas chambers. I was not among the 1 million, but I am among the very few survivors who are able to tell our stories and tell their stories and encourage everybody in this room that what you do matters when you see discrimination against anyone for whatever reason, because the Holocaust not only happened because there were Nazis who hated the Jews, it happened also because the millions of bystanders who saw what was happening to Jews and did absolutely nothing. I just want to encourage every one of you, please don't be a bystander. Thank you.